The Israeli-Palestinian situation, it's a topic that can feel overwhelming, right? It's such a tangled history, hard to know where to even begin.
Absolutely. Many people find it incredibly complex, almost too much to grasp.
But it's important. We know it is.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We want to try and bring some clarity.
So we've gathered a whole range of sources.
We have everything from analysis of the Abraham Accords, the economic outlook for the Middle East, deep dives into the Oslo Accords,
Peace process overviews, the challenges to peace building,
the role of Track 2 diplomacy, that's the unofficial kind, and breakdowns of those really core unresolved issues.
and the goal here is to pull out the key insights.
Exactly. The crucial moments, the persistent problems,
Mm.
just to give you a clearer, more understandable picture of the history, the current challenges, and maybe the different ways people see a path forward.
Okay, great. So let's jump right in. The Oslo Accords seem like a good starting point. They held so much promise at the time.
They really did. So the Oslo Accords, um, they were basically a set of agreements, right,
Mhm.
between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Signed back in the 90s.
Yeah, between 1993 and 1999. And the main goal, the ambition, was to work towards a final status agreement.
Supposedly by 1999.
That was the timeline, aiming for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. It was meant to be a phased process.
And a big part of that was creating the Palestinian Authority, the PA.
Precisely. The PA was set up to govern Palestinians in certain parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
But just as a temporary measure.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
An interim step, building up self-governance, leading towards that final peace deal. And for most Palestinians, the expectation was, well, pretty clear.
Independence, right. Their own state alongside Israel.
Yes, the two-state solution that we still talk so much about today, that was the hope riding on Oslo.
But obviously, that initial optimism, it faded pretty significantly. What went wrong? What were the big setbacks?
Well, quite a few things didn't go as hoped, even while the accords were technically in place. A major one was the accelerated expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
Faster than before.
Yes. And this expansion really started to fragment the land that was supposedly being negotiated for a future Palestinian state. It made a contiguous, viable state much harder to envision.
So the physical reality on the ground was changing in a way that undermined the process.
Definitely. And beyond settlements, you also saw increasingly tough restrictions on Palestinian movement, checkpoints, permits. It really choked daily life and the economy.
And demolitions, too.
Yes, Palestinian home demolitions also sped up. Often the justification was lack of building permits. But getting those permits from Israeli authorities was, well, often next to impossible for Palestinians.
It sounds like the whole structure of the negotiating table itself was tilted from the start.
Oh, absolutely. And the whole setup for Oslo, or it really highlighted this huge power difference. You had Israel, a nuclear power, backed by the U.S. negotiating with Palestinians living under occupation without a state.
And the U.S. role in that.
Well, some observers, people who were involved like Aaron David Miller, felt the U.S. often acted more like Israel's attorney than a neutral mediator, prioritizing Israeli concerns.
That perception alone must have damaged trust.
Hugely. And then you had outright violence aimed at derailing the whole thing. From Israeli extremists?
You mean like the Hebron massacre?
Exactly. 1994, an extremist settler killed 29 Palestinians praying in a mosque. A massive shock.
And then Rabin's assassination.
Yes, in 1995, the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, killed by a Jewish extremist who was furious about Oslo and any land concessions. It was just devastating for the peace camp in Israel.
Wow. Those events really underscore the volatility.
They do, and even the basic terms like withdrawal. There were disagreements there too, right?
You mean UN Resolution 242?
Yeah. It called for Israeli withdrawal from territories captured in '67. But how much territory and under what conditions? That's always been argued over.
So some argue Oslo actually made things worse in a way.
That's one perspective, yeah. That instead of paving the way for a state, it kind of, maybe unintentionally, legitimized the fragmentation through settlements, bypass roads for settlers, checkpoints, carving up the West Bank.
That's a pretty stark view that it might have entrenched the occupation.
It is. And part of that critique points to the security coordination between the PA and Israel. The argument goes that the PA effectively became a partner in managing the occupation and suppressing the intifada, the uprisings.
So, given that Oslo didn't deliver on his promise, maybe looking at the bigger picture, the longer history of peace attempts, is useful.
I think so. It helps to see the patterns, the recurring obstacles.
Okay, so can you give us a quick tour of some other key moments or proposals, maybe starting way back?
Sure. So right after the 1948 war, you had the 1949 armistice agreements. But the Arab states were very clear. These lines were not permanent borders, left the refugee issue hanging.
Then Camp David with Egypt and Israel.
Right, 1978, a huge step. But the talks about Palestinian autonomy happened without any actual Palestinians at the table.
A pretty major omission.
Definitely. Then 1991, the Madrid Conference. That was the first time you had face-to-face talks involving Israel, Arab states, and Palestinians, though the PLO itself was kind of behind the scenes.
And then we get into the period after Oslo started to falter.
Exactly. Camp David 2000. President Clinton brought Arafat and Israeli PM Barak together. Huge expectations, but it collapsed. Accounts differ on exactly what Israel offered.
But Arafat rejected it.
He rejected it without making a formal counteroffer, which was heavily criticized. Then Clinton put forward his parameters ideas about land swaps.
What about the Arab Peace Initiative?
That was 2002. A big deal. All Arab League members offered Israel full normalization.
Whole peace and normal relations.
Yes, in return for withdrawal to the 1967 borders and a just settlement for refugees. Israel rejected it.
Then the roadmap for peace?
2003, from the Quartet, the U.S., EU, UN, Russia. It laid out phases aiming for an independent Palestinian state. Again, didn't get there.
And more recent attempts.
Well, Israeli PM Olmert had a plan around 2007, 2008, involving land swaps, but they couldn't agree on the details, the percentages. Direct talks in 2010 under Obama stalled. Netanyahu had conditions. Palestinians rejected them.
Abbas had a plan too, right?
Yeah. Mahmoud Abbas in 2014 proposed a 3-year withdrawal to 67 lines, but it needed a settlement freeze and prisoner release first. The U.S. rejected it.
And finally, the Trump plan.
Which the Palestinians boycotted entirely and condemned. So you look at this whole list.
It's kind of depressing, honestly.
It is. You see this pattern. Proposals crash against the rocks of territory, security, refugees. The core issues. Not enough trust, not enough flexibility, maybe.
Were there any other ideas floating around, maybe outside the official channels?
There were. The Geneva Accord in 2003 was quite detailed, worked out by former Israeli and Palestinian officials unofficially.
What about a one-state or binational solution?
That idea, one single secular state for everyone, comes up, but it faces huge opposition on both sides. Most Israelis and Palestinians seem to want their own national state.
Any other concepts?
There was talk of a shelf agreement, basically. Finalize a peace deal, but don't implement it right away. Put it on the shelf for later.
But how would that work?
That was the question. Skepticism about whether it would ever actually be implemented.
Okay, so all these failures really highlight the big sticking points. Let's dig into those current issues. Refugees seem like a massive one.
Absolutely fundamental. It goes back to 1948, the war surrounding Israel's creation. Around 700,000 Palestinians were displaced then.
And now with descendants, it's millions.
Approaching 4 million, yes. And the core demand from the Palestinian side is the right of return to go back to their original homes and lands inside what is now Israel.
Which Israel rejects.
Firmly. Israel's arguments are several. One, they say the refugee crisis wouldn't exist if the Arab states hadn't attacked in 48 after rejecting the UN plan.
Okay, what else?
They point out that Israel's declaration guaranteed equality for Arabs who stayed. They also note other refugee groups globally didn't get a right of return. And they argue UN resolutions talk about a just settlement, not explicitly a right of return, and say this should also apply to Jewish refugees forced out of Arab countries.
So comparing the two refugee situations.
Right. Israel absorbed Jewish refugees. They argue Arab states should have absorbed Palestinian refugees.
And the Palestinian view on return?
It's seen as a fundamental right, a right to return to Israel proper, plus compensation for losses. For some, it's also about changing Israel's demography. Others focus more on returning to a future Palestinian state, not Israel itself.
And Israel's position on that?
Israel supports the idea of refugees returning to a future Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but not returning en masse to Israel itself. They see that as an existential threat to the state's Jewish character.
Has money compensation ever been seriously discussed?
It's been discussed as part of a package, yes. But there are huge disagreements on how much would be adequate, who would pay, and whether it's acceptable in lieu of return.
Okay, another huge issue, security, especially for Israel.
Critically important for Israel, given the history and geography. The challenge is balancing Israel's security needs with Palestinian demands for a truly sovereign state.
What does Israel see as its key security needs regarding a Palestinian state?
A demilitarized West Bank is usually top of the list. No heavy weapons. They point to what happened after they pulled out of Gaza. Hamas took over. Rockets were fired into Israel. The West Bank is much closer to Israel's main cities.
But Palestinians would see that as limiting their sovereignty.
Exactly. They argue an independent state should have the right to defend itself like any other nation without those kinds of imposed limits.
And the security barrier, or wall, where does that fit in?
Israel built it largely during the Second Intifada, citing the need to stop suicide bombers. And they argue it's been effective in reducing attacks.
But the impact on Palestinians?
It's had a massive impact. It cuts deep into the West Bank in places, separating farmers from fields, people from jobs, communities from each other. Huge criticism over its route and the disruption from checkpoints. Even Israel's own Supreme Court has ordered changes to the route sometimes.
And that brings us back to settlements, another physical obstacle.
A huge one. These Israeli communities built on the West Bank made drawing a border incredibly difficult.
Why were they built initially?
Some early ones were presented as security outposts or reestablishing communities that existed before 1948.
But later motivations changed.
Yes, ideology became much more prominent than religious or historical belief in a right to live in the entire land, but also practical reasons.
Like cheaper housing.
Exactly. Settlements offered more affordable housing compared to inside Israel, especially near the big cities, attracted Israelis who weren't necessarily strong ideologues.
Is Israeli opinion united on settlements?
Not entirely. There's generally less opposition to building in East Jerusalem, which Israel annexed, or in the big settlement blocks near the Green Line, the pre-67 border. More controversy surrounds the isolated settlements deep in the West Bank.
And the Palestinian view.
Pretty much universal. All settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are illegal under international law and a fundamental barrier to a viable, connected Palestinian state.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The Abraham Accords. They felt like a major change in the region.
They definitely were a significant shift. Normalization deals between Israel and several Arab states, UAE, Bahrain, later Sudan and Morocco.
Driven by?
Largely by the UAE, it seems, with at least quiet approval from Saudi Arabia. Driven by shared concerns, maybe about Iran and national interests, economic, strategic.
And they've led to real cooperation.
Yes, in areas like trade, investment, tech, defense, tourism, there are new connections being built. There's even the Abrahamic Family House in Abu Dhabi, a complex with a mosque, church, and synagogue, trying to foster interfaith ties separately from the conflict itself.
But what are the risks? Does this bypass the Palestinian issue?
That's the main concern, yes. That normalization happens without progress on the Israeli-Palestinian track. Some worry it could actually encourage more hardline Israeli policies, especially with the current right-wing government.
Like what happened after the Egypt-Israel peace?
Some draw that parallel, yes, that Israel secured peace with Egypt, but then felt freer to consolidate its hold on the West Bank. The argument is that for these accords to really help long-term stability, they need to be used to push for progress on the core conflict, too.
Towards a two-state solution or something else?
Whether it's two states or some other arrangement both sides can live with, the accords create new dynamics, new leverage that could potentially be used.
Have there been other consequences of the accords?
Well, one thing noted is an uptick in arms sales involving the signatory countries. Israel is a major defense exporter now in that context.
And how are the accords sold domestically in those Arab countries?
Reports suggest quite a bit of state-sponsored promotion, linking normalization to economic benefits, development, modernity, making it harder for critics to speak out.
Any specific examples?
Sources mention the UAE linking ties directly to prosperity, sometimes alongside disinformation about Palestinians. Bahrain framed it partly as fighting anti-Semitism, highlighting the ruling family's history of tolerance.
Okay, let's zoom out even further. What's the general economic picture in the Middle East? Does that play into all this?
It's a really crucial backdrop. The region faces some massive economic headwinds. Look at Yemen, for instance. The war there has been devastating economically. GDP per capita halved, civil servants often unpaid, poverty soaring.
And youth unemployment, I hear that's a big problem.
Huge. Across the Middle East and North Africa, EMEA, they're around 25%. That's the highest in the world. And this is despite young people being more educated than ever before.
Are women participating in the workforce?
Participation rates are still very low compared to global averages.
So limited opportunities, especially for young people.
Yes. And you see the result. In places like Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Lebanon, lots of young people say they want to emigrate because they just don't see a future at home.
Can you give some numbers?
Sure. Morocco's youth unemployment is near 40%. Saudi Arabia, at least 20%. Jordan, it's about a third for young women.
Even Iran.
Yes. Economic grievances, inflation, jobs, corruption are major complaints there. It's led to currency collapses, political turmoil.
So when the Abraham Accords promise economic benefits.
You have to see that against this background of widespread economic pain and frustration. Those high unemployment rates, the desire to leave that creates instability, makes people vulnerable to extreme ideas sometimes.
Okay, one last area to cover.
Yep.
Track 2, diplomacy. What is that exactly?
Track 2 is basically unofficial diplomacy. It's about informal talks, interactions between people not acting in an official government capacity. Academics, former officials, civil society figures.
And the goal?
It's often about building relationships, fostering understanding, exploring new ideas away from the pressure of formal negotiations, trying to ease tensions, keep communication lines open, especially when official talks are stuck.
Where does this happen?
Often academic institutions or think tanks provide a neutral space. You get scholar-practitioner collaborations. And having native language speakers involved is seen as really key.
Why native speakers specifically?
Because they get the cultural nuances, the unspoken codes, the historical context, in a way that translation alone often misses. It leads to deeper understanding.
So how is it different from track 1, the official stuff?
Track 1 is government to government, focused on reaching formal agreements, often short-term. Track 2 is usually longer-term, focuses on relationship building, tackling those deep historical grievances that official diplomacy sometimes skirts around.
Are there other tracks?
Yeah, the terms can get a bit fuzzy. Track 1.5 might mix official and unofficial people. Track 3 is more grassroots people-to-people efforts. But Track 2 is often seen as this important bridge.
Is it effective? How do you measure that?
That's tricky because it's unofficial. Success isn't always a signed treaty. It might be about generating new ideas that filter up to Track I later, or just building trust between influential individuals.
What makes it work well?
Research points to a few things. Generating new ideas, definitely. Building those personal relationships, having skilled, culturally sensitive moderators. It may be the hardest to measure. Actually changing perceptions and attitudes among the people involved.
It sounds like it takes a different approach to conflict itself.
Yes, there's a critique that Western mediation can be too linear, problem-solution agreement. Track 2, drawing sometimes on more indigenous perspectives, might see conflict as more cyclical, interconnected, needing long-term work on relationships and underlying issues.
So 4 main outputs of good track 2.
Generating ideas, building relationships, effective moderation, and changing perceptions. That last one is tough to quantify, but potentially the most transformative.
It really is just an incredibly complex picture, isn't it?
It truly is. As we've tried to show in this deep dive, getting to peace in the Israeli-Palestinian context and the wider region, it's incredibly complicated. So many layers.
Deep historical roots, power imbalances, security fears, political roadblocks.
Exactly.
All tangled together.
And understanding that history, the failed attempts, the core issues that won't go away, and all the different players involved, official and unofficial, it seems essential just to follow the conversation intelligently.
Absolutely crucial. Because while big agreements or political shifts grab headlines, lasting stability probably depends on tackling those fundamental things. Security for everyone, rights for everyone, real economic hope for everyone.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe for you listening. Given this whole tangled history, all the failed attempts, the current pressures, what do you think is the single most critical thing needed right now? What's the key ingredient to finding a more sustainable path towards, well, coexistence and stability, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, but across the Middle East? Something to ponder?